Some days there's just a lot to talk about on the Morning Pit, and that's certainly the case today. As we're going to be talking about the Pitt basketball schedule that came out 2 days ago, but we didn't get a chance to talk about it yesterday. We're going to talk about Pitt's pass rush. We're going to talk about the quarterback situation. We're going to talk about the schedule the rest of the way, what Pitt got laying out there, what Pitt has laying out in front of it over the next 8 games. There's a lot to cover, so don't go anywhere. Stay right here for the Morning Pit on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. It's Thursday. It's almost the end of the week. We're getting there, folks. It's the Morning Pit here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. I'm Chris Peak from Panther-Lair.com. You know that, of course. It's Panther-Lair.com. It's the website, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Sometimes I forget the words that I mean to say, but I get them out eventually. It's the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet. Football, basketball, and recruiting. You can find it all at Panther-Lair.com and message boards to interact with other Pitt fans all day, every day. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, and the YouTube site, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. It's a thing you want to subscribe to. The YouTube channel you want to subscribe to if you're a Pitt fan. You never want to miss any of our exclusive Pitt video content, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We have these daily Morning Pitt videos, Monday through Friday. We have our weekly live show like we did last night, Wednesday night at 8:30 p.m. Me and Jim Hammett get together for a little hour of Pitt sports talk right here at youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. And we, of course, have the live post-game show. I'm looking forward to this on Saturday night. It's a night game. It's, an 8 o'clock kickoff at Virginia Tech. But unlike last week's game, which was an 8 o'clock kickoff, where we didn't start the post-game show until 1 a.m., we'll start much earlier this time. It's going to start around like 11 or so because, last week, home game, go to the post-game press conferences and all those different things sort of occupy your time where, driving home from the stadium and everything else. So you start the post-game show a little bit later. When it's on the road like this, we get started shortly after the game ends. I think the West Virginia game, we went live almost immediately and had a great crowd there. A lot of people wanted to talk about that game, not necessarily for good reasons. I think they'll want to talk about this game for better reasons. We'll talk about the upcoming schedule here in a minute, but you don't want to miss the post-game show. That's some of the most lively, live streams that we do. And it's right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. So make sure you like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on notifications. You won't miss our post-game show, which is always fun to do. All right, there's a lot of things to talk about. Yesterday, I was going to talk about the Pitt Hoop schedule. It got released on Tuesday. I didn't get a chance to do it because we got caught up talking about the offensive line and Whitbill recruiting. But they announced finally the ACC schedule is out, kind of completing Pitt's 2023-24 schedule. A few general thoughts. The bye weeks kind of spread out. Not a bad spot here. You get 2 off, extended breaks. Typically they play, Tuesday and Saturday or Wednesday and Sunday, something like that, and pretty much go 2 games a week for most of the season. But during the ACC schedule, you get 2 points where you get like a week off between games. And their first one's in mid-January. They play Duke on January 9th at home, and then they don't have a game until the following, a week later. I forget if that's a Tuesday or Wednesday or weekend, what it is. But a week later, they have Syracuse at home on January 16th. So they get a break there, and then they get a break a couple weeks later. They go to NC State on February 7th. And then they have off until February 13th. They play at Virginia. And then they have 7 straight games over the final 3.5 weeks to end the season. I think last year, the year before, they had their off week on the final week of the season or something like that. And so their off week was not really it was like an extra day off before the ACC tournament, basically. And that wasn't really ideal because they ended up with some really long stretches of games. So here, they'll have a week off for finals in mid-December, a little bit of time around Christmas, I think, but not much. But then they'll get a week off in the middle of January and a week off in the middle of February. So I think it's a pretty good, in terms of the breaks and the buys and the off weeks, it's a pretty good little run here. They open, I think we predicted this when we saw the non-conference schedule. There was an opening on the weekend of December 3rd and 4th. They get Clemson that day. That's their first ACC game. But then they play a few more non-conference games after that. They really open the ACC schedule at Syracuse on December 30th. That's when it really kicks off. And you jump into all ACC games from there on out. You get Duke twice early in the schedule, January 9th and January 20th at home and then on the road respectively. That's a bit of a challenge. You get Carolina in that early stretch, but I mean, it's the ACC. I mean, there are tough opponents and not as tough opponents. Although I think that line is a little murkier than it's been in the past. I mean, I think for the past couple of years it's been murkier, and it'll continue to be because there's so many new faces and unknowns on each of these teams, Pitt included. Pitt at the forefront of that group of unknowns and new faces. So it's hard to totally predict what's going to be a tough schedule and a weak schedule, but I think you ultimately play everybody. You have the teams that you play twice, and that can go a bit in determining whether your schedule's tougher or not. Pitt having Duke twice is going to make it a little more challenging for sure. But on the whole, not a lot jumps out about the dates in particular. I think it's those off weeks. I think that's the first thing that I look at. I mean, they have a couple different stretches where they play 2 or 3 road games in a row, or they have 2 home games in a row. Oh, when do they have back-to-back home games, back-to-back road games? But what's most interesting to me is when they get those off weeks, those breaks, which they get them about once a month, basically, is how it worked out, roughly equal distance, apart. And that's about it of what really jumps out to me. They've got 5 games that are going to be on the CW. So you've got that. 3 of them are road games, Syracuse, Louisville, Miami. And then the Virginia Tech and NC State home games will be on the CW. 13 of their total games, ACC and non-conference, will be on the ACC network. 10 of those 13 are ACC games. So they have 10 games on the ACC network. Both Duke games will be on the ACC network. Both Wake Forest games will be on the ACC network. And then home games against Notre Dame, Louisville, and then road games at Virginia, Clemson, and Boston College will all be on the ACC network. A couple games on ESPN2, Florida, and West Virginia, although those could potentially be moved to ESPNU. The Missouri game, the ACC-SEC Challenge, will be on ESPNU. And then there's like 5 games that are still being determined if they'll be on ESPN, ESPN2, or ESPNU. 3 home games, Carolina, Syracuse, and Florida State, and then the road trips to Georgia Tech and NC State will be on one of those channels. You have 4 games on the ACC network extra, your non-conference games and whatnot. There's not... I think we pour over schedules for a day and then move on, and occasionally if something unique comes up later in the year that, look how that off week is affecting this or how this is affecting that, we get into it more. But largely, I think you just look at a couple of key things, like is the schedule front loaded or back loaded? When do you have time off? And maybe if you're interested in the TV assignments, like I am. But there's not a lot to, that's about all I'm taking out of this. And I think the off weeks, it's arguably the most interesting thing for sure. Flipping over to football, Pitt's going to Virginia Tech on Saturday night, so that game is coming up very close. Lane Stadium at night, apparently a sellout. Somebody told me. I didn't see this on social media, but this is what people told me. I mean, okay, go ahead, Virginia Tech. Good for you. You sold out your stadium, with a 1-3 team facing a 1-3 team. I guess they have a whiteout going on. Lane Stadium at night. Yeah, that's very, very cool. I still feel pretty good about Pitt's chances here. I think they can. I don't want to say things like right the ship. I mean, they are bouncing back to some extent. If they do go out and win, they're bouncing back to some extent because they'll have broken the losing streak, cut it off at 3 losses and improved to 2-3 as opposed to dropping to 1-4. So that would be a bounce back of sorts. It's going to be challenging in that environment, but I think this is a game they can win and probably should win. I talked about it yesterday. I've talked about it throughout the week that Virginia Tech's run defense is really suspect. I mean, giving up like 200 yards to just about everybody they've faced. Whether it's Rutgers or it's who they play, Marshall. It's not a very efficient run defense. It's not a very stout run defense. And for a team that wants to run the ball and I think can be pretty good at running the ball if they actually just commit to it, Pitt should be able to get yards on the ground against Virginia Tech. And I think if they can establish the run, then they can probably win this game. The key, and this is stupid football logic, but I think it's especially relevant with this team, is not turning the ball over at all, and particularly not in the passing game. And that's a little bit of a concern with Christian Vieira coming out of the North Carolina game where he threw the 2 interceptions. I know Pat Narduzzi sort of excused one of them and said Kenny Johnson slowed down on his route, and that's fine, but Vieira is not exactly known for taking care of the football, and you can't afford that. You can't afford that. So I think it's in Pitt's best interest to have Phil Dracovic back for this game. We'll see if he is available. We'll see what ends up coming out. Who knows? Pat Narduzzi may say, maybe later this afternoon we'll ask Pat Narduzzi, hey, is Phil going to be available? And he'll tell us. My guess is he won't, but he might. I think like he said, there's maybe not as much of an advantage to be gained when you're playing against Pitt as far as knowing which quarterback it is, just because they have similar styles. Dracovic and Vieira largely play the same way. Nate Arnell to some extent as well. They're all big quarterbacks. They have pretty good arms. Maybe accuracy questions, but they can move around a little bit. So it probably doesn't matter as much. So maybe Narduzzi will give up something in terms of the quarterback discussion and who's going to start and who's going to play. I think it would be in Pitt's best interest for Phil Dracovic to play. Thought he played okay in the first half against North Carolina, probably his best half that he's played this season, certainly against the real competition. But they're going to need to establish the run and not turn the ball over. And if they do that, I think if they run well, and run a lot, and the running backs get a combined total of like 25 or 30 carries, and they don't throw any interceptions, I think they'll win this game. It might not be pretty, and it probably won't be. It'll probably be an ugly game, but a win, certainly when you only have one after 4 games, a win is a win, right? And you take that. And I started looking, and I'll write more about this in the 3-2-1 column tomorrow, but I mean, you look down the rest of the schedule here, and yeah, there are a lot of challenges out there over these final 8 games, no question. I mean, Florida State and Notre Dame loom the largest, but you also have Louisville, Syracuse, and Duke that are all undefeated at this point as well. Pitt should beat Virginia Tech. They should probably beat Boston College. Not probably. I mean, I would say with whatever conviction I have that Pitt should beat Virginia Tech, I have that same conviction about Boston College. They should probably have a pretty good shot at beating Wake Forest. Given what Wake Forest has been so far this season, I don't think they've been particularly strong. And it looks like they're still trying to find out who they are and what they want to do. And so I think that's a winnable game as well. If you can take those 3 wins, if Pitt can beat those 3 teams, and that's not a given because, yes, Boston College and Virginia Tech are at the bottom of the ACC, but Pitt is not that far above. I mean, they're not above them. They have 1 win. They all have 1 win so far. So it's not like you're going to put Pitt very high on the totem pole above those other 2 teams. But if they are above them, and they do win those games, and if they can beat Wake Forest, you're now at 4 wins. To get to bowl eligibility, and I understand that we're now moving the goalposts into something very unimpressive. This is a 28-yard field goal, a 30-yard field goal now. But to get to bowl eligibility, then you just need to, I shouldn't say just, but you can get to bowl eligibility by winning 2 out of 3 against Louisville, Syracuse, and Duke, the current undefeated teams. And while those 3 teams are undefeated, they're all 4-0 at this point, and while Louisville beat Pitt last year, I don't think they're unwinnable games. I mean, even as bad as Pitt has looked, and I'm basing some of this on the fact that Syracuse and Duke are going to be late in the season, and so there'll be plenty of time for improvement and growth and progression with this team before they get to those games. But Pat Narduzzi's never lost to Duke. He's only lost to Syracuse once. He's 7-1 against Syracuse. Against Louisville, he's 2-1. He beat him in 15 and 20 and then lost last year. Louisville is the most recent game that he's lost to one of those 3 teams. But I'm going to need to see him lose to Duke before I believe he'll lose to Duke. And that's not dismissing what Duke has done this year, but even last year, under less than ideal circumstances, they were able to pull out a victory. Same thing against Syracuse. If you recall, in 2018, Syracuse was the darling of the ACC, top 15 team, I think, when they rolled into Heinz Field, and Pitt was reeling after losing to, Carolina. I mean, they had lost to Penn State in the 51-6 game. They lost to Carolina down there in a really brutal loss. They got beat up by UCF. They were in a bad spot. I think they were 2-3 at that point, and they welcomed Syracuse to Heinz Field at the time. Syracuse was top 15, and they end up still winning that game. And we know what that 2018 Pitt team went on to do. They went on to win the Coastal Division and advance to the ACC championship game. I'm not predicting that for this group. What I'm saying is that even then, when Syracuse was seemingly having its best season in years, Pitt still won and beat the Orange. And so, I don't want to say, well, I think Pitt will beat Duke and Syracuse because they always beat Duke and Syracuse, but they do always beat Duke and Syracuse. And I'm going to kind of stick with that until Duke and Syracuse beat Pitt. And maybe this is the year it happens. Maybe they do lose to Duke and Syracuse this year, but I'm going to wait and see before I kind of count on it or automatically chalk those up as L's for Pitt. So if you can take care of business against Virginia Tech and Boston College, and if you can beat Wake Forest and take 2 out of 3 against Syracuse, Duke, and Louisville, now you're bowl eligible. And again, that's not an admirable goal, although I think it becomes somewhat admirable if you start the season 1-3. If you dig yourself a big enough hole, then even the most modest of accomplishments can seem like real achievements. And that would be the case here. If they're able to battle back from 1-3 to finish, to go 5-3 over their final 8, I think that would be a pretty respectable performance in the final 2 months of the season. And that's, leaving aside the classic Pitt. Well, I was going to say that's leaving aside the classic Pitt, upset win, knocking off a Florida State or Notre Dame. But I think the reality is if we want to, leave wiggle room for that classic Pitt upset win, we probably have to leave wiggle room for the classic Pitt, disappointing loss. And who's to say that, if you monkey paw a win over Boston or a win over Notre Dame, does it open, do you lose a player who then costs you the game against Boston College? Do you offset it? Does there have to be an equal and opposite reaction to a win like that where you suffer a bad loss, subsequent? So just taking what's reasonable and rational, and I think fairly plausible, I can see a path to 6 wins for this team. Obviously, they have to do some of the things that we've talked a lot about. Phil Dracovic has to play better. He has to take what he was doing in the first half against North Carolina and the efficiency he was playing with and kind of taking what's there and not trying to force things and just making some easy throws. He has to take that and do that over the course of a full game. They have to ride Rodney Hammond. You know what I mean? They have to get the ball to Gavin Bartholomew. They have to get the ball to Konate Mumfield. They should get Kenny Johnson more involved. I've gone on and on and on about 6'9" and 86, about how those 3 need to be primary focal points in this offense. We'll see if that comes to pass. But Dracovic has to be more efficient, and Hammond, Rodney Hammond has to run the ball a lot. They have to run the ball a lot as a team, and they gotta feed Konate Mumfield and Gavin Bartholomew when they do look to pass. If they can do those things, they might not be a good team, in the end, but I think they can be good enough to win some of these games we're talking about, I think. Of course, they also could use improvement on the other side of the ball, and this was the other thing I've been wanting to talk about because I'm thinking about it a lot this week. Asked Pat Narduzzi about it, asked Charlie Partridge about it. I asked DeAndre Jules about it. I asked anybody who has something relevant, who might have something relevant to say about it. I've been asking them, and it's the pass rush, and it's Pitt's pass rush this season that's been such a strength for them in the past. Over the last few years, their defense has really been built off of the pass rush and how that group has played up front and with some big names, Patrick Jones, Rashad Weaver, Jalen Twyman, Kalijah Cansey, even up to guys like Haba Baldonado or even a John Morgan, or Deslin Alexander. I mean, they've had good players on the defensive line. And somehow this year's team is still tied for 11th nationally in sacks. And I'm surprised by that stat. You're probably not surprised by that stat now because it's Thursday and we've been talking about this stat all week. We've been writing about it and asking questions about it. But when I first saw that stat over the weekend or heading into Monday, I was surprised. I was like, wait, really? Because it doesn't feel like they've been getting that much pressure in the backfield. It doesn't feel like they've been making that much of an impact, particularly from the defensive line, but overall in the pass rush. It just doesn't feel like it's been clicking. And yet, there they are. 14 sacks, which is tied for 11th nationally. I think part of the problem is that there's nobody really sort of consistently dominating in the pass rush from the defensive line. Deion Hayes has 2 sacks. That's the most among the defensive linemen. Bam Brima has 1. DeAndre Jules has 1. Devin Danielson has 1.5. Sam Okunlola actually is tied with Deion Hayes for 2 sacks. I think he had 1 against Wofford, and he had 1 against North Carolina. But that's it. You're looking at 4 games in, and no defensive lineman has more than 2 sacks. And you don't expect everybody to have 5 sacks after 4 games, but you do expect somebody to seem like they're elevating themselves and rising up and being the guy. But nobody has really done that yet. Nobody has been that yet. And I think Charlie Partridge, when we talked to him, he said he's looking for one of those rotational guys to step up out of the group of Sam Okunlola, Jimmy Scott, and Nakai Johnson. I think, and he didn't say this, but I think he's looking for one of the top guys to step up too, out of Deion Hayes and Bam Brima and Nate Temple. Somebody's got to emerge there as well, and nobody has emerged there to this point. Saw Bam Brima move into the starting lineup. I think North Carolina game was his first start this season. Nate Temple, I believe, had started the first. Yeah, Nate Temple started the first 3 games. Bam Brima stepped into the starting lineup, the North Carolina game. And quite frankly, they should probably stick with that. That should probably be their starting lineup, or their starting end should be Hayes and Brima. All those guys are going to play, and they're going to play a lot, but that's probably the group you want to go with. And then more rotational snaps for guys like Okunlola, him in particular, and then see what you have with Nakai Johnson and Jimmy Scott. A big part of the drop-off from last year, of course, is the absence of Kalijah Cansey. He was a guy who, particularly in the middle of the defensive line, just made such an impact and affected the play in such considerable ways. But still, it just doesn't feel like you're getting what you need out of that group up front. I'm willing to say that maybe by the end of October we'll be talking about this differently. That maybe that group will be making an impact. But so far, it doesn't seem like they have been. Numbers be damned. It just doesn't seem like they're making that kind of impact. So that's something to keep an eye on too. As the back seven, really, the linebackers and the secondary all continues to grow. You need that front four to make their lives a little bit easier by getting to the quarterback, flushing him out, putting him under pressure, forcing decisions, forcing ideally bad decisions. You need that from those guys up front. So we'll see what Pitt's able to generate. This week when they go down to Virginia Tech and face, I'm not sure who's playing quarterback. Is it Kyron Drones or Grant Wells? Either way, you got to get after those guys because I don't know if either one of them is very good, and so you need to pressure them and make their life uncomfortable, make their life miserable as they try to pass against this Pitt defense. All right, tomorrow we'll have our mailbag edition. We got a lot of stuff here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, basketball stuff, football stuff, live shows, all those things. So like this video and subscribe, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you don't miss any of our exclusive Pitt video content. And then, of course, stay tuned to the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Looking forward to the post-game show on Saturday night. That should be a lot of fun, so make sure you tune in. I look forward to it. We will catch up with you tomorrow for the Friday mailbag edition of the Morning Pitt right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.